Good morning, everyone. This hearing will come to order. This hearing, titled Human Rights in Cuba Beyond the Veneer of Reform, would highlight the human rights situation in Cuba, prospects for democratic reform, and options for United States policies. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. I now will make an opening statement and then turn it over to the ranking member for his opening statement. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all to our witnesses for being here today to discuss the human rights situation in Cuba. As my colleagues know, this subject is deeply personal to me. I left Cuba and came to the United States when I was 11 years old. I am forever grateful that this country took me in. I work hard every day to represent each member of my district, including the many first-generation immigrants who, like me, were forced to leave their home countries in search of a better life. For this reason, it is especially painful for me that despite great progress over the last 6 decades to improve quality of life around the world, the Cuban regime remains stuck in the dark ages. This is a government that continues to lock up those who speak out against it. It is a government that criminalizes the core freedom that are the foundation of any democracy. It is a government that for 60 years has denied the Cuban people their rights to choose their own leaders. Some observers have hoped that economic openings, like the growing number of small businesses on the island, will pave the way for political reform as well. Unfortunately, the Cuban state has shown an ability to withstand those changes while remaining among the most repressive governments in the world. The Economist Intelligence Unit classifies Cuba as an authoritarian regime, and Freedom House rates Cuba as not free. This year, Cuba ranked 169th of 180 countries in global press freedom, according to the Reporters Without Borders. The Communist Party has accepted and even encouraged some cosmetic changes to give the impression that life on the island is improving. But the underlying reality of one-party rule remains intact. Even as internet access has expanded, those Cubans who can't afford to go online have their every move tracked by the state and are prohibited from accessing dozens of blocked websites. Cuban residents, Cuban citizens with the means to travel are increasingly allowed to do so, but only on the condition that they respect the long arm of the Cuban police state. For instance, activists seeking to travel into international forums to offer testimony about Cuba's human rights record are often prevented from leaving the island, despite the laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. A group of Cuban LGBT right activists were arrested, beaten by plainclothes security officers on May 11th when they organized a peaceful demonstration that the government has refused to authorize. It seems that the Cuban regime is always devising new strategies aimed at improving its international image without actually changing its system of one-party dominance. I know that we may not all agree about the best direction for U.S. policy towards Cuba, but I hope we can agree that the status quo in which 11 million people are denied their basic rights by Cuba's authoritarian regime is an injustice. It was in this spirit that earlier this year I introduced a resolution condemning conditions of forced labor that Cuban doctors are subjected to. The resolution contends that Cubans' foreign medical missions constitute human trafficking, given that the Cuban government forces doctors to participate in the program against their will and garnishes as much as 75% of their wages. In Venezuela, Cuban doctors were forced to withhold life-saving medical treatment from individuals who are not proving their political loyalties to the repressive Maduro regime. In this hearing, we will take a closer look at the human rights situation in Cuba and explore ways for the United States Congress to support the Cuban people in their quest for freedom. Thank you, and I now turn to the ranking member, Rooney, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this important hearing and for your great leadership of our committee. For almost 50 years, Fidel Castro ruled Cuba by repression, which denied the Cuban people their most basic human rights and violently crushed political dissent. Today, this system of intimidation and violence against those who speak out against the regime continues under Miguel Diaz-Canel, and the guiding hand of Raul Castro's behind that anyway. Under Fidel Castro, the Cuban regime spread its communist ideology throughout Latin America and in southern Africa. The Cuban regime continues to be the standard for repression in the Western Hemisphere. Today, we see its blueprint for tyranny in Venezuela and Nicaragua as it attempts to spread its repressive tactics to other states in the region. Under this regime, the Cuban people are deprived of their freedom of assembly, association, religion, and speech, as the government maximizes state control over all aspects of society. Like the old Soviet Union, this system of repression and control seeks to instill fear among the population and undermine the ideals of freedom and democracy. Until 2013, Cubans were required to obtain an exit visa and a letter of invitation to travel abroad, creating an island prison for millions of Cubans. Today, the regime restricts travel for many Cuban dissidents. Opposing the Cuban regime nearly guarantees government backlash and detention. In June of 2018, the Cuban so-called Commission for Human Rights and National Reconciliation released a public list of 120 political prisoners, including 96 nonviolent opponents of the regime. However, this number is probably a lot higher because it's impossible to determine the exact number of political prisoners in Cuba. The regime refuses to allow access to prisons and detention centers and to international organizations or the UN. The regime also engages in short-term detentions to intimidate and silence dissidents. In 2018, 2,873 short-term detentions were recorded. And in 2016, an all-time high of detentions was reached of 9,940. The island's human rights defenders, religious groups, and organized dissident groups are constantly harassed by the Cuban government and labeled as mercenaries. Their leaders are in constant danger of being detained. These groups include Las Damas de Blanco, that was formed by the wives and relatives of a group of 75 dissidents and arrested in 2003, and the Patriotic Union of Cuba, which was established in 2011 by another group of dissidents who peacefully sought to establish civil liberties and human rights. Many of their members, such as Amel Santiago Mas Hernandez, have died in prison after being detained for arbitrary crimes such as descato, or lack of respect for the government. Dr. Eduardo Cardet, who was in prison for 2.5 years for publicly criticizing Fidel Castro, while he was released in 2019, the release is conditional, and his right to move and assembly are restricted, keeping him as prisoners of conscience. The Cuban regime censors dissent through its control of the media. Private media in Cuba is illegal, and the government uses arbitrary detentions, threats, harassment, and censorship against journalists who criticize the regime. In 2018, 2 human rights organizations affiliated with the OAS reported that Cuba is the only country in the Western Hemisphere in which there are 0 guarantees of freedom of expression. To complement its repression at home, the Castro regime has exported thousands of its agents to Venezuela to prop up the illegitimate authoritarian Maduro regime in Venezuela and to struggle to maintain its own authoritarian grip on power. These Cuban agents have assisted in extrajudicial detention, torture, and intimidation of opponents of the Chavez and now Maduro regimes. They run the so-called Squadra Azul, the death squad of Maduro. The United States must exert maximum pressure on the Cuban regime to reform its government and stop the systematic human rights abuses against the Cuban people. The Obama administration's efforts to re-engage the Cuban regime, while noble, have failed to assure quantifiable improvements in human rights conditions and the rule of law. We must continue to support Cuba's human rights defenders and demand that the Cuban regime make substantive reforms that will allow for freedom. Access to information is absolutely critical, and support for independent news and information must continue to engage the Cuban people. I support the administration in no longer rewarding the Castro regime for its human rights abuses and for calling on the government to end its repression of innocent Cubans. I look forward to hearing the testimonies today, and once again, I appreciate Chairman Suarez for his leadership and for his personal interest in background story pertaining to the abuses of Cuba. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Rooney. I will now introduce our witnesses. Let me introduce first Mr. Carlos Quesada, Executive Director of the International Institute on Race, Equality, and Human Rights. He has 25 years of experience working before the Organization of American States and its different bodies, and is a trained journalist and a lawyer. We will then hear from Mr. Carlos Martinez de la Serna, Program Director, Program Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Mr. Martinez worked as a reporter and a digital journalist in the United States, Spain, and Japan, covering current affairs, and is the former Director of Digital Innovations at Univision News. Welcome. Finally, we would hear from Mr. John Suarez, Executive Director of the Center for a Free Cuba. Previously, Mr. Suarez was a program officer for Latin American programs at Freedom House and a human rights activist, and he's a member of the Cuban Democratic Directorate. Thank you all for being here. I ask the witness to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. Thank you so much for being here today. And Mr. Quesada, I turn to you for your testimony.
Chairman Suarez, Ranking Member Rooney, and members of the Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere, Civil Security and Trade, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to share critical information regarding the human rights in Cuba, prospects for democratic reform, and options for U.S. policy. I commend the committee for holding this important and timely hearing. Given our extensive work with civil society, with independent Cuban civil society, my testimony today will focus on threats and challenges to human rights defenders in Cuba and the methods employed by the Cuban government to criminalize or otherwise restrict the work of civil society organizations and activists. This criminalization has resulted in a population of political prisoners totaling 100 and disproportionately impacts historically marginalized population. The human rights situation in Cuba is dire and can be characterized as a war of attrition between the government and independent civil society activists. State authorities routinely violate the fundamental freedoms enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by harassing, threatening, detaining, and interrogating activists and their families. The principal threats and challenges to human rights defenders in Cuba include the new constitution and restrictions on fundamental rights. Furthermore, the arbitrary manner in which the Cuban justice system operates, the principal method by which activists are criminalized, is a threat in and of itself. The contrived approval of the new constitution in the February 24th referendum ushered in a new era with regard to legal guarantees for human rights in Cuba, in a calculated move to create a loophole through which it can avoid complying with international human rights treaty obligations. The Cuban government altered the text of the new constitution to grant it supremacy over international law. Freedom of expression and opinion is not existent in Cuba. Independent civil society organizations are not permitted to legally register in violation to their right to freedom of association. Activists and their family members face constant psychological torture. And we just find out that private companies such as Western Union may collaborate with government authorities to criminalize human rights activists, in clear violation of those activists' rights to privacy. Finally, arbitrary detentions and further violations of due process guarantees are commonplace. The principal methods employed by the Cuban government to criminalize or otherwise restrict the work of civil society organizations and activists include the misuse of the justice system and travel restrictions. Police and investigating authorities have broad and unchecked powers to detain and investigate individuals for up to 7 days without the right to consular judicial review. Crimes in the Cuban Penal Code are so vaguely defined that they can be used to criminalize almost any behavior. Sham trials involving false witnesses are used to convict activists. For the past 2 years, we have documented cases of political prisoners and the crimes for which they are convicted. Let me be clear. Although the vast majority of these individuals are charged with common crimes, they are political prisoners, criminalized because of their activisms of their way of thinking. In the coming weeks, we will be publishing a report exposing this intricacies of the administration of justice in Cuba. Independent civil society activists are frequently prohibited from leaving Cuba to participate in regional and international advocacy spaces as a tactic to prevent the world from knowing the reality of the human rights situation in Cuba. Most recently, 5 activists that my organization had planned to bring to the Organization of American States General Assembly in Medellin, Colombia, were prevented from leaving the country. The only justification ever offered is national security interests. It is worth noting that activists who are women, Afro-descendants, and members of the LGBTI community disproportionately suffer human rights violations in Cuba. Their intersectional characteristics make them particularly vulnerable to multiple forms of discrimination. Female activists, for example, routinely confront physical and psychological violence against which they have no recourse, given Cuba's lack of legislation prohibiting gender-based violence. Racial slurs are commonly employed against Afro-descendant activists who, the saying goes, should be grateful because the revolution made Black people human. And members of the LGBTI community are facing a new reality after the violent crackdown they experienced during the independently organized Pride March on May 11th of this year. Chairman Sidis, Ranking Member Rooney, and members of the subcommittee. Human rights in Cuba should remain a priority focus for the U.S. government. The fundamental rights of activists, whose work is the country's best prospect for democratic reform, are systematically violated. As such, I would like to offer the following recommendations. Continue to monitor and expose the human rights situation in Cuba. Request the Cuban government immediately release all political prisoners. Offer public support for independent civil society activists and journalists. Expand the U.S. diplomatic presence in order to have more direct contact with independent civil society organizations on the island. Encourage the Cuban government to engage in a dialogue with independent civil society regarding human rights issues. And request from Western Union information about how it operates in Cuba and how government officials can have access to information about activists receiving money from abroad. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Martinez, you're recognized.
Chair Cyrus, Ranking Member Rooney, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on press freedom in Cuba. My name is Carlos Martinez de la Serna, and I am the Program Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. CPA is an independent, non-profit organization that promotes press freedom worldwide and defends the rights of journalists to report the news safely and without fear of reprisal. In this testimony, I will highlight some of the most urgent press freedom issues in Cuba. I will also provide recommendations on how to support Cuba's journalists and to help improve conditions for independent media in Cuba. Even as Cuba has seen some points of tight state control over media and freedom of expression loosen over the last decade, the country continues to be one of the Western Hemisphere's most difficult environments for the press. Independent and critical Cuban journalists constantly face the possibility of detention, having their homes or devices searched, their reporting equipment confiscated, and even criminal prosecution or anti-state charges. The slowly expanding influence of the internet has opened up new avenues for expression and journalistic work, but has also expanded the set of tools at Cuban officials' disposal to monitor, surveil, and censor journalists, media workers, and private citizens. Over the last decade, in the midst of this established repressive infrastructure, a lively blogosphere, a number of new, ambitious websites and media outlets has sprung up on the island. This new media expansion began in earnest in 2011, when then-President Raul Castro introduced market-style reforms, opening up economic space for the creation of a number of outlets that began as what were essentially personal blogs and then grew into independent sites. With the restoration of diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba in 2014, the process accelerated, and the number of blogs, magazines, and independent media proliferated to cover a variety of issues. However, despite these efforts, the energized press alone could not overturn the country's restrictive legal framework. Life in Cuba for many reporters and activists is characterized by arbitrary privacy violations. Short-term arrests are still one of the most common tools used by Cuban authorities to intimidate and control the press. The state maintained bans on the import of informational materials, a strict control of all forms of media, and restrictions on the internet. Changes in top leadership in the Cuban government have not translated to any meaningful alteration in legislation governing media freedom or freedom of expression. There is a long way to go in Cuba. In order to improve its record on free expression, Cuba must take the following steps. Ratify and implement international human rights agreements to guarantee freedom of expression and information. end the use of detention, surveillance, and smear campaigns against independent journalists and bloggers, remove legal barriers to individual internet access, and extend affordable access to the population at large, and dismantle a legal framework that punishes independent journalism. We also urge members of Congress to speak publicly about the journalists and outlets who are subject to detention, travel prohibitions, and other state-sponsored harassment. Support initiatives to expand affordable internet access in Cuba and access to platforms and tools that will allow Cubans to exercise the right to free expression online without enforced surveillance or censorship, and urge the administration to stand up for Cuba's journalists both publicly and privately as well. In addition, the United States government should consider Cuban journalists' work as a basis for a well-founded fear of persecution if and when they apply for asylum or refugee status. While there are still many hurdles on the path to U.S.-Cuba normalization, the effect of greater communication between both countries could be positive for freedom of expression on the island. As a result, journalists will hopefully be able to do their jobs without the constant threat of violence or imprisonment solely for reporting and expressing critical opinions, and with the prospect of internet access without filters, obstructions, or prohibitive costs. Thank you for providing CPA with the opportunity to address you about this important matter.
Thank you, Mr. Suarez.
Chairman Cetus, Ranking Member Rooney, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this privilege to provide testimony on human rights in Cuba. My name is John Suarez. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for a Free Cuba, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to the promotion of human rights in Cuba. To understand the human rights situation in Cuba, one must understand what came before. Cuba had regular competitive elections, and between 1944 and 1952, presidents who respected human rights and civil liberties. This was reflected in the role Cuban diplomats played in 1948 in pushing for regional and international human rights covenants. All of this came crashing down with Fulgencio Batista's military coup in 1952. The Castro brothers promised to restore democracy while imposing a communist dictatorship in 1959. In May 1961, they confiscated private schools and most seminaries to eliminate religion. In September 1961, the Castro regime at gunpoint collected 131 priests, brothers, and a bishop, placed them on board the Spanish ship Covadonga, and deported them from Cuba. Today, the Office of Religious Affairs, an arm of the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party, still oversees religious affairs in Cuba and exists to monitor, hinder, and restrict religious activities. 60 years later, Fidel Castro is gone, but his brother Raul remains along with the communist regime. What is called reform in Cuba has been a fraud for the dynastic succession of the Castro family. Raul Castro remains in control of the government as head of the Communist Party. His son, Alejandro Castro Espín, a colonel in the Ministry of the Interior, presided over the Cuban side in the negotiations to normalize relations during the previous administration. In 2018, Raul Castro presided over the revision of the current constitution that was subjected to a referendum on February 24, 2019. On February 24th, Cubans were called to the polls to ratify a new constitution that, despite cosmetic changes, enshrines the principles of the existing one-party political system. Basic conditions for free and fair elections were not fulfilled, independent observers were not allowed, and numerous voting irregularities were reported. This is the third time during the communist era that the Constitution was changed. The Communist Party remains the only legal political party. The maximum authority in the regime resides with the head of the Cuban Communist Party. The late dissident leader, Osvaldo Payá Sardiñas, called this fraudulent change. There have been no improvements that alter the nature of the Cuban regime. It is a one-party communist dictatorship run by the Castros. Opposition groups in Cuba are not legally recognized, and independent civil society is actively discouraged. Independent human rights organizations in Cuba are illegal. There is no space for free expression in Cuba. The Cuban government attempted to create a fake space for debate on the constitutional referendum, but when independent actors attempted to speak in them freely, the response was swift and brutal. Over the past 16 months, 2 decrees have further undermined and restricted human rights. Decree 349, signed by President Díaz-Canel in 2018, further restricts and controls artistic expression in Cuba. This provoked protests by independent artists. Many were arbitrarily detained, and at least 2 have been jailed for a prolonged period. Decree 68, issued on July 4, 2019, prohibits Cuban citizens from running websites hosted outside of the country. Cubans continue to defy the dictatorship and demand their rights and freedoms, often paying a terrible cost. With us today is Sir Lei Avila Leone. Sir Lei was a delegate to the Municipal Assembly of People's Power in Cuba for 7 years when the regime eliminated her district. She had fought to open a school in her district, but had been ignored by official channels and had reached out to international media. Her son, Yorlis Peña Avila, who had an 18-year distinguished career in the Cuban military, was forced out when he refused to declare his mother insane and have her committed. Surley joined the dissident movement and repression against her increased. On May 24, 2015, she was a victim of a machete attack carried out by Osmani Carrion that led to the loss of her left hand, right upper arm nearly severed, and knees slashed into. Following the attack, she did not receive adequate care and was told quietly by medical doctors that if she wanted to get better, she would need to leave Cuba. This is not new. Cubans sought freedom by fleeing the island. While others have protested for their rights over decades, the response has often been brutal. 25 years ago, on July 13, 1994, regime agents killed 37 Cubans when they tried to flee to freedom aboard the 13 de Marzo tugboat. Less than a month later, August 5, 1994, the streets of Havana erupted with thousands of protesters chanting Libertad were repressed. Cuban dissident Osvaldo Payán, March 30, 2012, warned about the Cuban government's effort to perpetuate itself in power. He also knew what real change would look like and argued that the gradual approach only makes sense if there are transparent prospects of freedom and rights. Osvaldo also reminded many who have forgotten that we Cubans have a right to our rights. Human rights and the Cuban struggle for freedom are not an afterthought, but the central issue in the dispute between Cubans and the dictatorship. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Suarez. Now we'll go to questions. I will start with the questioning. The New York Times reported that Cuban doctors in Venezuela were being forced to withhold life-saving medical assistance in order to coerce desperate individuals into voting for the Maduro regime. I introduced a resolution to classify the medical missions that these doctors were part of as human trafficking. Can you speak about how the Cuban regime has profited from its medical missions and whether the U.S. Congress should take steps to assist the victims of these medical missions? Can anyone speak to that?
Yes, the issue of human
Turn your mic on.
The issue of human trafficking is something that, fortunately, has been, in the latest report on trafficking, reflects that Cuba is in the blacklist for that issue. And we're talking about healthcare professionals in this case, and they do have a duty to put the revolution first and their medical duty second. And that is something that you mentioned that is reflected in what is taking place in Venezuela and in other places. The regime is profiting to the tunes of billions of dollars a year in this export of doctors. There are tens of thousands of doctors across the world, not only in Venezuela, but also in Mexico, and across Africa, and areas of the Middle East, and they are the chief source of revenue for the Castro regime. I think that a return to a policy that protects those doctors and provides them with refuge would be a welcome step forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was disturbed to hear about Cuban LGBT activists being arrested and beaten up for participating in a peaceful demonstration in May. What have you been hearing from the LGBT activists and organizations on the island, and is there a concern that the overall situation for LGBT rights defenders is worsening in Cuba? Mr. Quesada?
Yeah, we've been working with LGBT activists for more than 7 years, independent LGBT activists. The main problem, I think, before the May 11th march was the cancellation of the typical conga by the CNSX, and the CNSX is the Center for Sexual Education, run by Mariela Castro, Raul Castro's daughter. So independent civil society, LGBT activists decided that they would like to have like an independent march. 4 of our partners were actually detained before the march took place. And CNSX actually decided to organize a party the same day on May 11th at the same time of the march. A lot of people were not allowed to actually go to the march, like the main LGBTI activists. We know that they were interrogated up to for 24 hours. They were told that they have 2 options, either leave the country or face jail time. Some of them actually have left the country already. And in general, I would say, regarding the human rights situation of LGBT people, there are two main problems. One is the kind of the monopoly of the state in terms of LGBT rights, and the lack of participation by independent LGBTI activists to even LGBTI activities outside of Cuba. That's what I would say.
Anybody else want to add to that? You know, the Chinese company, Huawei, has worked closely with the Cuban state communications monopoly to develop the country's telecommunications infrastructure. Given this company's close ties to the Chinese Communist Party, are you concerned about this in Cuba? Martinez, anybody?
Yes, we're very concerned. The Chinese have a record of developing a very sophisticated system of control, not only censorship, but also monitoring and locating dissidents. In the past, they did it with the help of companies such as Yahoo in China, and activists were imprisoned, some were tortured and killed. And we're very fearful, and I think considering the new decree that came out on July 4th, the prospects that they'll be targeting cyber activists has increased dramatically in Cuba. And with Huawei's help, unfortunately, they'll be able to be quite effective in targeting these activists.
Thank you. Ranking Member Rooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to ask Mr. Suarez, since you mentioned about websites and internet, the Wall Street Journal had a picture this week of a bunch of Cuban kids sitting on a curb, all on their phones, just like any other kid would be right here, talking about the extension of 3G in Cuba and the protests that the young people are having now over the price of it. I wonder if that gives us an opportunity and how you feel about the opportunities that technology might present to help chink at the armor there.
Well, I think that the Castro regime has had a series of strategies of control. Initially, they just did not provide access to internet to anyone in the island. It was dramatically restricted. Cuba had some of the lowest levels of internet connectivity in the hemisphere. Between 2002 and 2008, the Castro regime outlawed the purchase of computers in Cuba. Now they've shifted, and they've allowed more access. They've allowed 3G recently. But what they're doing hand in hand with it is this new Decree 68 from July 4th, which is now going to be going after those cyber activists that have set up platforms outside of the island where the regime has less control, and they're pushing to have those shut down. And they're going to be becoming more restrictive internally with their Chinese friends, with the Golden Shield, which has been very effective in mainland China. I believe they're going to be applying those tactics inside of Cuba. So it's going to be a very long, hard road for independent journalists that until now have been able to get their work out of the island and then back in.
No Romanian moment imminent. No Ceausescu moment imminent yet.
No.
But an opportunity. The other thing I'd like to ask any of you all that would like to answer is about religious freedom in Cuba. When I was there, the Spanish priest that we talked to said that the government pre-clears their sermons. They'll let them have Mass, but the government's there, and they are pretty restrictive about it. I know Cardinal Ortega personally, and I know he's been very controversial. Half the people think he's too much close to Castro. Half the people thinks he's doing all he can. So any comments that you all might have on what opportunities we may have to deal with some of the challenges to religious freedom in Cuba?
Well, I think that one thing that the U.S. can do that would be of great assistance would be to push for the Cuban government to shut down the Office of Religious Affairs. I think it's an outrage that the Central Committee of the Communist Party oversees religious life in Cuba. And Pope John Paul II, during his visit in 1998, requested that that be closed down. It has not been. And I think it's an area where if a lot of light is brought on it and a lot of international attention, it's an embarrassment for the Castro regime, and I think it could be something that would be a positive step forward for religious freedom if that office is gotten rid of.
Anybody else have a comment? Please, Dr. Quesada.
I would like to actually to add the fact that, how the government manipulates, so to speak, the freedom of religions in Cuba. And I would like to use the example of Article 68 in the proposed constitution that guarantees gay marriage in Cuba. So the article was literally taken out of the proposed constitution according to the government because the religious groups were not happy about it. And actually the religious groups in Cuba were very active against that article. And the government allowed those fundamentalists, if I can use the word, to actually take the Article 68 out of the proposed constitution. So what I'm saying here is that sometimes, they allow the religious freedom for their own purpose, and sometimes they just restrict the freedom of religion.
I'd like one more question for whoever would like to answer it. Lenin said the capitalists will sell us the rope we'll use to hang them with. And I wonder if there's a role for international business in the United States to push international business, to push companies that are working there, which there are many, to not deal through Gaesa and break that link between employers and their employees and the clever way the Cubans are keeping capitalism out of the system down there.
Well, I think you brought up a very important matter. Gaesa, which is run by Raul Castro's son-in-law, controls close to 60% of the Cuban economy and has the bulk of the tourist industry is run under Gaesa, which is an arm of the Cuban military establishment. I think that it would be very positive if international business followed the path that was followed in South Africa with the Sullivan Principles. There's a case, a few years back, they came up with something called the Arcos Principles, named after another prominent Cuban human rights defender that would have principled investment inside of Cuba. I also think it's important to point out that perhaps we should highlight the numerous business people from Western democracies that have been locked up in Cuba, and their crime has been that the Cuban government hasn't been able to pay the bill that it owes them. So then the response is they lock them up and then loot them completely.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Congressman Levin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Quesada, I was interested in the comment you just made. It sounds like there are troubling parallels between the Cuban government and our own in terms of their kowtowing to religious groups and limiting the freedom of LGBTQ people in both of these countries. So I hope we can make progress on that. You mentioned in your recommendations that you think the U.S. should expand its diplomatic presence in Cuba in order to have more direct contact with independent civil society groups. What is the history of our diplomatic presence over the last 10 years, and where is it today?
Sure. I think the main problem today is the lack of staff that the embassy has right now. When we had an interest office, so to speak, it was also limited, but when we had an embassy, when we became an embassy there were more personnel. People were, the different political or civil servants on the island were able to reach out to activists. And right now, because of the limited staff that the embassy has, basically, even though our partners on the ground has been telling us that they don't even have access now to the embassy as they used to have it before. So that's why I was recommending to have a more diplomatic presence, so to speak. And the other thing is that what we find out is that to visit political prisoners or former political prisoners is very important for them.
So we reestablished diplomatic relations in December of 2015 or thereabouts, and we built up our diplomatic presence, and now we have many fewer staff there.
Correct.
So it's hard for us to interact with these groups on the ground, support political prisoners and other things to advance the human rights cause without sufficient staff.
Correct.
Mr. Martinez, I'm curious about whether how you see the ability of journalists and organizations that support journalists like yourself to interact with their counterparts in Cuba, like American journalists, based on restrictions of travel and whatnot. Is it better to have more free travel of American journalists to Cuba and others who would support them, or less free interaction? Which would be better to support human rights in Cuba, and specifically the rights of journalists to do their work? You understand the question?
Well, I'm not sure what you want me to answer, yeah.
So we're going towards, in basically 2014 and 2015, we moved towards an idea that we should have more engagement with Cuba rather than less. Now we're moving in the other direction.
Yeah.
Restricting travel, restricting interaction, keeping Americans from going to Cuba. Is that helpful for the human rights of, and the freedom of journalists to work in Cuba, to restrict Americans' access?
Generally speaking, I don't think so. We need always more eyes on the ground and more interaction to understand the problems and also to support journalists on the ground.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I fear we're going in the wrong direction. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. Thank you to our witnesses. In the 1980s, I traveled with Amanda Valladares to the UN Human Rights Council, then called the Commission. He was able to get an important resolution passed as head of the U.S. delegation. As we all know, he spent close to 20 years in the gulags of Fidel Castro, was tortured horribly, and when he wrote Against All Hope, his memoir, he pointed out how systematic the brutality was by the Castro regime. There was commitments made to the UN personnel and to the families that came forward. There would be no retaliation. Almost to a person, there was retaliation. There's concern, it just expressed, that we don't have enough people working in the embassy, but let's not forget why those people were ordered home between November of 2016 and May of 2018. There were a number of unexplained injuries, cognitive loss, hearing loss. We don't know the full reason why, but it was very, very suspicious. So out of an abundance of caution and concern for our embassy personnel and their families, many were returned to the United States. And let me just say, after the rapprochement with Fidel Castro, I went and met, along with Piero Tozzi, our general counsel on the Human Rights Committee. I was chairman of it, held many hearings on Cuba, and met with Cabanas, asked him for a visa. I still haven't gotten it. He told me, they will tell me certain people I can talk to and not talk to. So I asked him, do other congressional delegations, when they go to Cuba, agree to those preconditions? And he said yes. And I would just admonish and encourage my fellow members that when you go, there should be an unfettered ability to talk to dissidents, to get into the prisons. And I would ask the panel whether or not the ICRC has had access, the International Committee for the Red Cross, to the prisons. And again, do they have concerns about these parameters that are put on members who then willingly accept them, apparently, when they go? Let me also bring out the issue of trafficking. President Obama had falsely and, I think, artificially upgraded Cuba. I'm the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, so I take very seriously all things related to trafficking. Frank Calzone, I remember when we were in Geneva one time at the Human Rights Commission, a van pulled over because he was bringing up child sex trafficking in Cuba and was punched by Cuban thugs who didn't like what he was doing in town. But I'm glad that this administration, Pompeo, has now downgraded Cuba to Tier 3. And in the narrative, make it very clear as to why that is the case, including these medical missions and the coercion that is used. But it was artificially upgraded. All these give and no take from the previous administration, I thought was ill-advised at best. I mean, human rights should always be at the core of what we do, and we need to see progress. There was no linkage to this opening of the embassy, and then what happens to our embassy personnel? They get sick. And again, we think there may have been some very... So my question, ICRC access to prisons, whether or not when members of Congress go there or other lawmakers, is it your knowledge that they agree to these preconditions? I'd love to go to Cuba. I've tried for 25 years to get into the prisons, have the door slammed by Fidel Castro, who once called me a provocateur for wanting to go to the prisons. I go to prisons all over the world. I've been in prisons in Indonesia, China, Beijing prison number 1, where Tiananmen Square activists were, the Perm Camp 35, the infamous prison where Nathan Sharansky was in the 1980s. I can't get into a prison in Cuba. So your thoughts on that? And again, and also on this trafficking downgrade, I should say, to Tier 3. Cuba is now with North Korea, China, Syria, Venezuela as an egregious violator of human trafficking, whether or not you agree with that.
The International Committee of the Red Cross, the last time they were able to visit a Cuban prison was in 1989. They had a small period between 1988 and 1989 that they were able to conduct some visits. Before that, it had been 1959. So we're talking 30 years since the last visit, and then another 30 years before that first visit, that first range of visits. And I think that's an area where there needs to be focus placed by the international community and calling on the Cuban government to allow the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is a nonpartisan entity, to have access to those prisons, to see what the conditions are, to see how the prisoners are being treated. With regards to Tier 3, I think that it's important to recall that when Cuba was redesignated Tier 2, experts in the anti-slavery movement came out and denounced it at the time as a politicization of the process. So I think returning Cuba to Tier 3 is the correct thing to do because it reflects the accurate situation on the ground. Thank you.
If I can add a little bit on the human rights situations in prisons. I mean, in general, the situation is very horrible, but it's particularly horrible for political prisoners. And I would like to mention the case of Mr. Eduardo Cardet, who was brutally beaten when he was detained. During prison, he was attacked. He didn't have access to medical attention for a long time. I mean, we have documented his whole case, and it shows the level of violence that political prisoners face in a Cuban prison, and this has been denounced by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the United Nations. And I just like to tell you that last year Cuba was reviewed under the Universal Periodic Review, and some countries actually make recommendations about improving the situation of prisoners in Cuba.
Thank you, Mr. Quesada. Congressman Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. The Obama administration a few years back now, I believe, started to try to normalize relations with Cuba, first diplomatically, because folks believed that after the Castro era was over, that there would be an opening for the United States to have legitimately have a better relationship with Cuba, that Cuba would perhaps become democratic, that it would fundamentally change. And we wanted to establish that relationship before other countries like China or Russia or Venezuela or others solidified their hold on Cuba for another 30 or 40 or 50 years. So I guess my question to you all is, how has governance changed, if at all, since the Castro regime? And who's in charge now? What's the state of governance in Cuba?
I would like to talk about from the human rights perspective. And unfortunately, the human rights situation has not changed. The situation right now, as it was in the previous administration or other administrations, I mean, if you are a person who thinks differently in Cuba, you face the consequences, basically. And we haven't, in terms of human rights and the situation of human rights, we haven't seen any change. What we have seen is the consistency of the government to commit human rights violations. And this has been said by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and UN treaty bodies.
If I can add on freedom of expression, there hasn't been any reform on the legal system supporting all the repression on independent journalism, and there's no sign we see that that's going to happen under the current government.
In your estimation, has there been any move closer to democracy, real democracy?
No.
With regards to who's running Cuba, Raul Castro. Under the Cuban system, the maximum authority is the head of the Communist Party, and that is the title that he holds. He also was the individual who oversaw the constitutional reform process in 2018. Secondly,
so you're saying that you still believe that he's strongly in control?
He's strongly in place, but also in the negotiations for normalizing relations between 2013 and 2014, it was Alejandro Castro Espín, Raul Castro's son, who was the person that the U.S. was negotiating with. So the Castro family is still very much.
Now, bear in mind, he's what, 80, late 80s at this point?
Raul Castro is the late 80s. Alejandro Castro is 53. And he's a colonel in the Ministry of the Interior who has a very hostile view towards the United States. I think it's also important to recall that when the U.S. diplomats went to Havana to begin the process of normalizing relations and opening up the embassy, that Russian spy ships were in Havana Harbor to send a very clear message. And I think also if we look at that period when the negotiations were taking place, in 2013, Cuba was caught smuggling tons of weapons to North Korea. Cuba was caught a few months later involved in a shipment of ammunition to Colombia. So they're very much an outlaw state in terms of their behavior. And I think also talking about the diplomats, American diplomats have been harmed since November 2016, which has led to this pullback at the U.S. Embassy. But it's also important to remember Canadian diplomats have been harmed. Canada, that has had very good relations with Cuba, has also had to pull back, and they've had to reduce their presence. So now Cubans cannot get, in the same way that they have to go to a third country to get visas to be able to visit the U.S., they're having to do the same with Canada. So it's definitely a step back.
And also, I wanted to ask you about access to information now. For example, if you go to China, you can't get on Facebook. Has that improved in Cuba at all?
I think in that regards, there's some slight improvement. There's internet, there's cell phones, and there's access to Facebook. That's probably one of the most critical opportunities to promote access to information, the free flow of information in Cuba, but providing or helping build an independent internet infrastructure that cannot easily be controlled, surveilled, and blocked by the government, which is what's happening today.
I yield back, Chairman.
I would add one thing, that on July 4th, they passed a new decree, Decree 68, which now will prohibit Cuban citizens from running websites hosted outside of the country, which was one of the ways they're able to get uncensored information produced from inside and then reflected back into the island. So it looks like that opening may be closing.
Thank you.
Congressman, take your home.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you gentlemen being here. Can you describe the impact the restriction on basic human rights over many generations has had on the broader Cuban population? That's number one. And well, go ahead and answer that question first. You know, for 60 years of repression and suppression and suppression of free thought, freedom of speech, what effect has that had on the Cuban population, on their outlook on freedom and things like that?
It's very hard for me, having not been exposed to such a situation, right, to assess what that means.
Right.
So I don't want to venture into that. It's just 60 years of not having access to independent information, to free debate on public issues and on many other things. That's catastrophic.
It is. It squashes hope and outlook for the future, right? And so we know that. Mr. Quesada?
Yes, I would say that since they have access to internet and Facebook and those kind of things, we can see kind of two generations. And the younger generation is more exposed to outside information and what's going on outside. And this has changed the minds of a lot of youth. And I would say, unfortunately, a negative side of it has been like, if you ask today a young Cuban if they want to stay in Cuba, the answer will be no. They want to have what they've seen on the internet.
That's interesting. And so one of my questions for clarification, was there any positive effect that the Cuban people, secondary to the relaxation of travel and other restrictions that were lifted by the previous administration, the Obama administration, was there any positive effects of that?
Definitely on the journalism side, as
On the what side?
on journalism, as journalists were able to get out of Cuba, come to the U.S., engage with journalists here and other places, and get back into the country. So,
But at the same time, weren't there more people going to prison for the journalists going? Weren't there more going?
the repressive the repressive tactics have kind of shifted, so we are not seeing long-term sentences.
Not long-term, but
short-term detention.
short ones, but more people
As an intimidation
going.
tactic, yeah.
Right. Did these changes give any more freedom to the Cuban people, or was there any increase in abuses by the authoritarian figures who were acting on their own or directed by the Cuban government? Anybody?
Well, during this process, as a colleague just suggested, there was an increase in arbitrary detentions, but there was also, and we're talking going back to 2011, 2012, the case of high-profile figures in the opposition who were extrajudicially executed, as the case of Osvaldo Paya and Harold Cepero. There's also a very suspicious death of the founding leader of the Ladies in White, Laro Poyano,
Right.
which in both cases I think there should be serious international investigations. There was also an increase of violence, of machete attacks. We brought today Sir Lei Avila Leone, who was a victim of such an attack in May of 2015, but there have been others.
Right. Unfortunately, I feel like Mr. Levin in that I don't see a change coming, which is unfortunately, when we see these other countries doing trade with Cuba, what other countries are there helping press the Cuban government to improve their human rights and independent press? Are there any other countries standing up?
Yes, during the Universal Periodic Review of Cuba last year, a lot of countries, specifically from Western Europe and the Nordics, were like pushing Cuba, or asking to improve the human rights conditions of journalists, human rights defenders, activists, etc.
But how far are they willing to go? Because don't a lot of those countries operate the hotels and the resorts, don't they? And they know that money goes to the Cuban government, not to the Cuban people. And so I see them complicit in providing the funding for the Cuban government. And yeah, they say we need more open press and things like that, but yet I don't see the actions living up to the rhetoric they say they want to help.
Congressman, I don't know the level of investment of like Sweden in Cuba or something like that, but yeah.
All right, so I guess along that same lines, how effective do you think the international bodies like the UN or the EU or the OAS are on, I know they document this, but invoking a change? And as long as a Castro is there, I don't think it's going to change. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
I think, unfortunately, when this drive for normalization took place with the U.S., it had a negative impact with regards to the European Union. The European Union in 1996 had set up a common position which conditioned their relationship with Cuba with improving human rights standards. And during this normalization process, that position was retired, and now they're pursuing this normalize their relations with the regime without having that human rights element being conditional. And that's a profound setback.
Thanks for pointing that out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congressman Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of our witnesses. I think it's fair to say that during the Obama administration, we made some steps in opening up trade and relations with Cuba. I think that door has been considerably closed since the Trump administration has been in office. Curious from each of your perspectives, how would you quickly articulate what our current strategy is relative to Cuba?
The current strategy is looking at Cuba within a regional context. Cuba has thousands of soldiers and intelligence assets in Venezuela that are playing a very negative role. They're also playing a negative role in Nicaragua. So the administration has chosen to tighten sanctions on Cuba in an effort to leverage influence for them to improve as actors in Venezuela.
Okay. Mr. Martinez?
I'm sorry, that's out of my scope of expertise.
Okay.
Yeah,
Quesada?
I'm working on human rights exclusively, so yeah.
Okay. Do any of you feel that our current sanctions, and particularly the embargo, have had any effect in ending communism or benefiting the people of Cuba?
That's, again, out of the scope. What I can tell is having, and I specifically mentioned that during my testimony, that trying to cultivate diplomatic relation on specifically freedom of expression, which is my area of expertise, we believe would be positive for the development journalism, independent journalism in Cuba.
Any other comments? Mr. Suarez?
I think that the issues of economic sanctions has much more to do with containment of Cuba in the region than it does with, in terms of changing the system inside the island. I do think that if you're going to be having investments and relations in Cuba, it needs to be with everyday Cubans and not with the Cuban military and the intelligence apparatus. Unfortunately, a good chunk of the Cuban economy is run by the Cuban military. And we've seen when the discussion came initially, when the administration was talking about limiting trade with those military entities, there were people on this side saying that makes it very difficult because a good chunk of the economy is run by the military. So if you're opening up trade and building up the most repressive elements of the regime, I don't think that's going to be positive long-term. And during the Obama administration, there was an expansion of military control over sectors of the economy that had been controlled by less negative actors in the Cuban system. The Office of the Historian in Havana had most of the hotels that they had in downtown taken over by the military during this opening. Secondly, I think it's also interesting to note that exports between the U.S. and Cuba, exports of U.S. products, collapsed during the Obama administration. The top year of trade, according to the Census Bureau, was the last year of the Bush administration, which I believe was over $700 million. After the normalization of relations in December of 2014, that dropped to about $149 million.
I'm glad you bring up trade. That was one of my questions. Is there a way that we could expand trade, benefit the Cuban people, without enriching those who we don't want to see enriched?
I think it would be focusing on individual Cubans and also pushing for the Cuban government to make reforms where business people can directly pay a Cuban employee and not have to go through a government agency where they take 90% and then the employee gets 10%.
Is that possible?
To make the demand and to push for it is very possible. Now, whether they'll respond positively, I don't know. It should be an effort that is made and then see what they do.
Okay. Mr. Quesada or Mr. Martinez?
I'm not an expert on trade. I'd just like to add that internet is a critical piece in the building of the system of repression and also opening in Cuba, and in terms of like it empowers people directly, and in terms of communications, helping expand its access, expand its being out of surveillance and controlled by the state can be a critical piece in terms of fostering development of all kinds, including freedom of the press.
Okay.
I would just like to mention that as a lawyer, I mean, there has to be a lot of amendments and changes in the Cuban law in order to have an effective way of have trade. And based on our experience looking at all the Cuban laws, I don't think it's possible right now.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. We're going to go a second round of questions if you have some time, because I want to get something clarified in my mind. You know, we talk about investing in Cuba. People talk about investing in Cuba. That's how it's going to help the Cuban people. But if I am a company and I want to open up a business in Cuba and I need 200 employees, how does that work with the Cuban government?
Well, the state is the main employer in Cuba. So if you want to have employees, like you can open your own business, but if you want to have, like in the tourism industry, for instance, a lot of the people that work there, they're hired as with a state employer company. So if you, if you're an activist and you think differently, you're unemployed, basically. You cannot have access to a lot of jobs there.
How does the salary work, Mr. Suarez? Because some people are under the impression that when you open up a business in Cuba, they get the salary and betters the people.
No, you have to pay to a government bureau who in turn, you pay in hard currency to a government bureau who then in turn pays the Cuban in Cuban pesos, which is a fraction of the value. I think it's also important talking about business investments. We looked at the Google had a recent agreement with the Cuban government, and they have their servers in Cuba that is helping to speed up internet. Now, that demand to have the servers in Cuba, which we've seen in places like China, is so that the Cuban services can have access to those servers. And that creates a number of problems. And again, they're doing business, but their business is directly with the Cuban government, and that obviously benefits the Cuban intelligence service in terms of the ability to surveil what Cubans are doing on the internet and who they're communicating with.
What's the unemployment rate in Cuba now? Anybody know?
I can find out. I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay. Congressman Rooney?
Listening to Mr. Suarez again, I'm thinking of Lenin and the capitalist quote here. And I think there's got to be some role to make the American people realize how Gaesa's got a stranglehold on the employees and how it prevents the spread of true capitalist ideology by breaking that link. And if you have any more to elaborate on that and on the cost of internet, now that that genie's a little bit out of the box and they're going to try to ration it through cost, how you feel that might play out.
I mean, the prices have dropped somewhat, so things have improved in terms of access. But I think the paradox is they're shifting strategies. Their strategy before was to ration access, and now their strategy is to control the information that they have access to through the internet. And that's why they've passed this new decree, which is going to make it much more difficult to get information outside. I'm not terribly optimistic over the long run for Facebook and other platforms. They have their own domestic versions that they've created with the help of the Chinese. And we know that the Chinese have already barred Facebook and YouTube and some of these other platforms in China. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that also taking place in Cuba. But I think it is important to point out that Cuba remains a communist regime. It doesn't respect private property rights. In addition to Cubans being still expropriated today by the regime when they do too well, we also find a number of Western businessmen who, when the government couldn't pay their bills, the way they solved the problem was to lock them up. Businessmen from Canada, the United Kingdom, from Italy, Chile, and other places.
Of course, they took the risk.
Yes, and they paid a very high price.
They could have stood up to Gaesa and other people and said, we'll only come in. The parallel to China with Google's a little alarming there. But one more question, if I might then. How effective have our important international organizations like the UN, the EU, and our OAS been in affecting the discussion of human rights in Cuba?
I think it's very important. One of the things is that I've met with members of the OAS, and they constantly ask, the Cubans tell us that they don't care what we say in our reports. But what we found is when a precautionary measure or an urgent action is issued, you see a shift in behavior by the Cuban regime with those specific victims. And I think you could see that with the case of Eduardo and others, that when that precautionary measure, when that light is focused in on that prisoner, they change their behavior. Cuba does take the UN Human Rights Council very seriously. They put a lot of resources to put a big dog and pony show during the Universal Periodic Review. They try to do everything possible to block activists from addressing it. There was a meeting recently on UN Committee on Race where they blocked the Afro-Cuban activists from attending, and at the same time claimed during that meeting that there was no racism in Cuba. So they do try to put on a very strong diplomatic offensive, and I think it's important for the international community and for the United States to highlight human rights at the regional level and at the international level, and it does make a difference.
Thank you. I yield. Thank you.
Congressman Smith, you have another question?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask you, Mr. Suarez, I think your point about containment was extremely well taken, and I thank you for it. Europe and Canada traded to their heart's content. So if just trade would have led to a Cuban dictatorship matriculating to a democracy, well, why did it happen with that? So containment and the ability to do even worse harm I think your point was, like I said, very well taken. Let me ask you your thought. You know, I'll never forget on December 17, 2014, the Washington Post did an editorial, and it went like this: Obama gives the Castro regime in Cuba an undeserved bailout. And the way, and this is the Washington Post, it's not the Washington Times, it's a very liberal newspaper, their editorial board concluded that on Wednesday, the Castros suddenly obtained a comprehensive bailout from the Obama administration. President Obama granted the regime everything on its wish list that was within its power to grant. Full diplomatic relations will be established. Cuba's placed on the list of terrorism sponsors reviewed and restrictions lifted on U.S. investment, and most travel to Cuba went on from there. You know, in retrospect, many of us believe that there should have been a linkage to human rights. I said it. I held hearings on it, and you know, we got just a cold stare from the administration on all of that. And like I said, they falsified the reporting on human trafficking to give them a passing grade, and I find that absolutely unconscionable. No matter how you want to deal with a country diplomatically, you do not falsify their report and their record, I should say, on human trafficking, and yet the Obama administration did. Your thoughts on whether or not the Washington Post got it right? And finally, you talked about Google. I held a series of hearings on Google and their relationship with the Chinese government and how they share personally identifiable information whenever the secret police asks for it. 2006, I had a hearing right here, had Google testify, and they basically said, as did Yahoo, Microsoft, and one other organization, company, that, under oath, that if they're asked to give information to the secret police, what would you like? Now, is that what's happening in Cuba, too, with Google?
That's what I believe is happening in Cuba for them to be able to continue operating there.
Wow, that's incredible. That means that there is no privacy whatsoever for any Cuban citizen, and Google is complicit in working with the regime. But if you could speak to what I thought was a very, very well-spoken, or written, I should say, editorial by the Washington Post.
The Washington Post got it right. One of the things that was most shocking at the time was that, if you recall, there were Cuban spies, the Cuban Five, that the remaining three were freed during that agreement. One of them, Gerardo Hernandez, was serving a double life sentence, one for his espionage against the United States, but secondly for murder conspiracy in the Brothers to the Rescue shoot-down, where 3 U.S. citizens and a U.S. resident were killed on February 24th, 1996. Gerardo Hernandez was the head of that spy network and was providing information that led to that shoot-down. They were returned to Cuba as conquering heroes. It was a great propaganda victory because the regime had since the year 1998-2000, been doing this big campaign, Free the Five. So that was an immense victory for the dictatorship, both internally and internationally, because they had those spies touring the world, basically expressing their defiance. Now, these spies, in addition to sabotage and their involvement with the Brothers to the Rescue shoot-down, have been involved in plotting based on instructions from Havana to engage in terrorist actions on U.S. soil. They were instructed to send death threats to a retired CIA official and eventually send him a mail bomb and kill him. And that was in the diskettes that were recovered by the FBI from the spy network. So releasing those individuals, I think, was a grave error.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Yoho?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just think it's ludicrous that anybody thinks they're going to change habits down there. You know, when they, in 2014, when they opened up relationships and they talked about, well, they'll get free and expanded internet service, yeah, there might be a little bump up in that for the Cuban people, but overall it empowers the Cuban government. And with what China's doing and their close association, with an improved internet service, they are going to do the same thing that Xi Jinping in China is doing with facial recognition and the good citizen scores, and they're going to control their population more than they've ever been controlled before. Do the people in Cuba, is the broader Cuban population aware of the human rights abuses and the political prisoners? I mean, you guys do your best to get the information out, but how aware are they in Cuba, or are they immune to what's going on and saying, yeah, that's just life in Cuba?
Regarding the situation of political prisoners within the island, they share information through the internet. So, you know, like when Eduardo Cardet was released, for instance, you know, his family sent out some messages, and the human rights activists, I'm talking about the human rights activists, they were able to know that
But how much disseminated is that? How well disseminated is that?
I cannot answer that.
Overall, I mean, people are pretty much, they can become complacent, say that's life in Cuba, right?
Information is pretty much controlled. Yeah.
Okay. How effective are the broadcasts from Radio Television Marti out of Miami? I've been there. It's a phenomenal operation. How effective is that getting freedom ideas to Cuba?
Well, I think that shortwave radio is a critical way to bypass government controls. They can do jamming up to a certain point of shortwave, but it's not as complete as it can be with the internet, where you've seen dictatorships just turn off the internet in some extreme examples.
Right.
Cuban activist Ricardo Bofill, one of the deans of human rights in Cuba from the 1970s, 1980s, described that there was a demarcation point before and after Radio Marti in terms of the impact it had on the island, in terms of people being able to hear a different point of view, of hearing voices of other activists broadcast back into the island was something that had a big impact.
Are any
Still does.
thumb drives getting down there, or CDs, or
Sure.
those kind? Are they getting in there?
They are.
What is a better way for us to help get information to Cuba for the Cuban people?
I don't think it's an either or. I think shortwave is something that needs to be maintained.
All the above?
And all the above. I think also it's important to mention that during the Obama administration, they lifted restrictions to attempt to get a cable from the U.S. to Cuba.
Right.
And it was Cuba that said they weren't interested and instead ran the cable from Venezuela.
Sure. And it's all going to be controlled by China, or China's going to have their 5G. China's got, I think, 60% of the 5G network in the world today. And this is just one more area it's going to go. And they're going to use the despotic things that Xi Jinping has offered to Maduro, to Putin, to the Iranian Ayatollahs, and it'll be in Castro. And it'll be complete control, George Orwellian, of the people of those nations. And it's something that we need to wake up as, and I wish these other countries would wake up that are doing business, because we know if you do business with Cuba, 90% of that money goes to the Cuban government. Penances go to the Cuban people, and they keep them repressed and suppressed, and it's not going to change unless the people are empowered to change, and it's what you guys do. Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here today for this important hearing. Human rights in Cuba continue to be curtailed by the regime. I will continue working with my colleagues to shed light on these abuses. I thank the witnesses and all members for being here today. With that, the committee is adjourned.
Violation of our rights to travel to Cuba, how travel actually is a positive thing, how ridiculous it is to call doctors human trafficking. Do you know how many people have been helped by Cuban doctors around the world?
But if the doctors aren't able to travel with their families, they're not being paid, they're being restricted in terms of their ability to move around.
I've met them all over the world, and they
Have you
all
met the
over
ones that are
world.
suing the Cuban government for human trafficking?
I've met the ones all over the world who are very delighted to be able to
Have you met
help
the ones
people
that are
around the
suing,
world.
and are you met the ones in Brazil that are suing the Cuban government for
There's
trafficking?
always going to be a
We'll
couple
send
of
a
people
report
But have you
who do
met
that.
once it's ready.
I want to know
A
what
report
you
on
think
the
of
administration of justice to your
exports
office,
to
Congressman.
a country like Saudi Arabia. I'd rather the U.S. exported doctors all over the world than bombs.
Oh, I agree with you. We
And
should
do you
be.
care about the LGBT community in the Middle East, where you would be
Yes, and
murdered?
I think it's also, I've been at the UN Human Rights Council, for example, when they tried to bring up the issue of LGBT rights, and then a majority of states said that it was a cultural issue, not a human rights issue.
Well, it would be nice if somebody on the panel mentioned that Cuba has one of the best health statistics in the world.
They have the best healthcare statistics. It just doesn't reflect the reality on the ground.
Oh, it does, because
No, it
if
doesn't.
you don't die of infant mortality or maternal mortality, then you're alive. And so that is a statistics, that's a fact.
Great testimony, John.
Thank you.
It's just a fact, it's not a made-up thing. Cuba
It
has
is a
the
made-up
best-
thing. No, I have family there.
Do you-
I know what it really
I
is,
do
and it's
too.
a.
Do you look at what, and, you know, why don't you have a witness here who would talk about something like either U.S. travel to Cuba would be a positive thing, it was a positive thing, why can I go to any country in the